All right, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are reading Hannah Arendt's On Revolution, and today we are reading the first three sections of the chapter 2, on the social question. Um, Now, many of you know that Hannah Arendt has courted controversy in her days. Usually it's often thought to be around things like her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, and things of that sort, and also her essay on Little Rock. Um, but if there's a third part of Arendt's work that has become incredibly controversial and highly criticized, it's this. It's her writing on the social and the social question. Um, and today and next week we're going to delve into that. Again, our effort is to try and understand her, which doesn't mean to have to agree with her. And so I look forward to the conversation as we try and make sense of um, I think I think a fairly difficult but also exciting and provocative aspect of her work. I mean, one thing I'll just say at the beginning, and it's something we've all noticed many times in our reading of Hannah Arendt, she's a thinker of distinctions. Um, she believes that it's important to give words meaning, and so she'll make distinctions between things like um, labor and work, as she does in The Human Condition, or as we talked about last week, between freedom and liberty. She's going to make meaningful distinctions. Um, and here she's going to make important distinctions between um, uh, the social and the political, also between poverty and misery. Um, and we'll have to see how those hold up. Just to remind ourselves where we are, in the first two sessions on revolution, we situated the book as an attempt to turn away from the history of freedom as a history of willing. So the idea of freedom understood as free will, and instead to turn to think about political freedom. So it's instead of a philosophy of freedom, as she explores in, for example, in the second part of The Life of the Mind on willing, she's here looking at a different tradition, a tradition of freedom that comes out of political action, men of action, as she calls it. And for her, freedom is at its root the power to act in concert, uh, the power that a group of people have to get together and act and build something, whether it's a Hannah Arendt Center or a theater or um, a reading group, whatever it is, or a politics. People come together and act, and that's power for her. Um, a revolution, as she explained in the chapter on the meaning of revolution, has two sources for her. One is the experience of freedom. It's the experience of this power, of this experience of being free, of acting in concert and beginning. And she thinks that in many ways it was in the process of the revolution, in the act of being revolutionaries, that the men of the revolutions gave meaning to and came to understand what revolutions were. They didn't start with a theory. They found it out through the experience of acting freely. And in that experience of acting freely, they came to love the power that they acquired, that they found in that action, that freedom, and they sought to then build um, a government that would protect that freedom. That's very much how she is going to understand the American Revolution to some extent, and we'll get there later in later chapters. The second part of a revolution, besides the experience of freedom, was the experience of beginning something new, right? And so it's specifically that there's something joyful. We're about to have our big conference on joy at the Hannah Arendt Center. There's something joyous about beginning something new, that starting a new story, being spontaneous, being free. And so for her, the question of the revolution is this question of the joy, the power in beginning something new, and in the experience of freedom in beginning something new. We asked this question. She asked this question in 1963. We're asking it in 2025 amidst what she would call a revolutionary situation, right? The idea that the authority of the old, the pillars of the tradition, our liberal democratic tradition has been shattered. Uh, some people want to just tear it apart. Other people want to, in a sense, salvage it. Those are two options. A third option is to begin something new, a much more revolutionary option. And Arendt is going to always remind us that if you're going to be a revolutionary, you first have to do some thinking. You have to think what it is that would bring a people together, create the kind of solidarity upon which a new authority and a new world could emerge. Um, that's the first step. And if you don't do that step, nothing else will work, because you can break things apart, but it's very hard to put them back together. But even if you have the idea, you're probably going to need to exercise some sort of violence, right? She cites this line both in the first chapter and in the introduction, where she says that whatever brotherhood human beings may be capable of has grown out of fratricide. Whatever political organization men may have achieved has its origin in crime. And one of the reasons Machiavelli is what she calls the spiritual father of revolutions is because he understood the importance of violence in revolutionary politics, or in politics. But what Machiavelli didn't understand, and is new, is that in the modern age, when we speak of revolutions, we talk about the revolutions from the low and the poor, from those who had lived in darkness and were subjected to the powers that be. And it's a revolution in the name of um, the poor and the exploited, who will rise and become free in a modern revolutionary frame. That said, from that, thinkers like Hegel and Marx took from the French Revolution, and not from the American Revolution, this idea that there's a historical necessity to the rise of the poor, to to a certain kind of revolution in one direction. And Arendt says that it was the French Revolution, not the American Revolution, that set the world on fire. Um, in that, to that extent, she thinks that the revolutionary tradition that comes out of the French Revolution ignores one of the great insights of the American Revolution, namely the deep concern with the forms of government, um, namely constitutionalism, which Arendt is going to make central to her understanding of a revolution that founds freedom, as opposed to one that fails to found freedom. And she says that the Russians and other revolutionaries learned from the French um, that they should follow history and the laws of history rather than action, and she calls them the fools of history in that sense. The chapter we're beginning today, chapter 2, the social question, begins with saying that the revolutionaries may have been fools of history, in the sense that they may have latched themselves onto the train of history, and in doing so, sacrificed their freedom of action. But they were no fools, right? They understood something quite powerful. And what they understood is the power of the life process, she calls it. Now, for those of you who've read The Human Condition, you'll know that the life process is another word that translates laboring, but it simply means that we eat to live, and that most of what we do is governed by our need and our desire to live, to eat, to have housing, to procreate, things of that sort. And that's a very powerful force. And what Arendt is going to argue here in this chapter on the social question is that um, the revolutionaries missed their moment to found freedom because it ceased to aim at freedom and instead sought to guarantee the life process, or another way of putting it, to guarantee the happiness of the people. Um, and that's going to be the argument that she makes, that the revolutionaries changed their focus, at least in France, from freedom to happiness, from freedom to life and the necessities of life. So, how does this argument unfold? It begins by saying that the social question, and again, the social question has to be heard as a distinction from the political question. The political question is the question of freedom. How do you found freedom, which is what she thought all the revolutionaries began their efforts aiming at. The social question is different. It's not about freedom, it's about poverty. Um, and what she says is that the social question politicizes poverty, right? Now, one might say, yes, of course, and that's a good thing, and that makes some sense. But what she wants to say is that poverty is universal, right? There's never been a world without poverty. Now, we can we can we can contest that, right? We can talk about certain anthropological societies uh, that in which there was a kind of equality and no poverty. Um, and there are some, as far as I've been able to tell. But what she thinks is that in most civilizations, um, there are always inequalities. Whether even if you have the same, amount of food to eat, you're always going to have certain inequalities of power, of status, of something. Um, and she says that the social question, which emerges in the 18th and 19th centuries, starts to say that poverty is an option. It's not necessary, and it sees poverty as dehumanizing, um, and um, and that we need to, in a sense, end poverty. Uh, uh, we have to make the choice to make everybody equal, or at least make nobody impoverished. And she says that in the end, what this means is that freedom is surrendered to necessity, and that we move from freedom to happiness. How does this happen? Well, she looks at Karl Marx, right, the great thinker of the social question and the revolutionary movement of the social question. And what Marx said, at least in his later work, right? She says there's a distinction. In his early work, Marx was largely a thinker of political freedom. But post the Communist Manifesto, Marx comes to believe that freedom and poverty are incompatible. Marx made poverty a political violation, a sign of exploitation. Um, and he, and in doing so, right, he said that the fundamental political question is ending poverty, and thus he depoliticizes freedom. He replaces freedom with happiness, with life, with comfort as the highest good. And Arendt on page 50, 58 calls this the politically most pernicious doctrine of the modern age, namely that life is the highest good. Uh, it stands for her for the idea that not freedom, but abundance or life is the highest good of human life and is now the aim of revolutions. That abundance and comfort and consumption have become the goal of revolutions as opposed to freedom. Uh, she says that uh, almost all revolutionaries after the French Revolution embraced this view, even if some of them also had instincts against it. And she offers the example of Vladimir Lenin, right? She says that Lenin, who obviously became a fairly conventional Marxist in the sense of the economic demand for equality, began and was when he was asked to state in one sentence the essence of the October Revolution, gave the formula electrification plus Soviets, namely a technology that will end poverty, electrification, and Soviets, a form of government that gives the power to the people. The Soviets are like a kind of um, local town hall councils that would govern factories and villages. And Arendt says that uh, that insight, goes back to the experience of freedom, shows that Lenin was a revolutionary, but that in the end, he didn't trust the people, right? He turned first to a technological solution, which is to provide, you know, abundance, namely electrification. But then he gave up on the Soviets because she says that he couldn't trust the people uh, to lead to freedom and to lead to equality. And so he elevated the Bolshevik Party and destroyed the Soviets. And in doing so, showed that he cared more about um, the social question, more about ending poverty than he did about freedom. And that is basically her argument about all modern revolutions, is that they give up on the constitutional, institutional um, protections of freedom because they don't trust the people or they don't like what the people do. And they try to, in a sense, put a technocratic party in charge that will uh, tell the people how to be free. Part two raises the question of the social question again through the idea of the predicament of the poor, and especially in America. Now, I'll just tell you, this is one of the most controversial uh, chapters or sections of all of Arendt's work. So I'm just going to try and do a reading of it, and I hope that will lead to a discussion of it. What she's saying here is that if you compare America and France, right, these two 18th century revolutions, there are great differences between them. And what she says, and she's gonna obviously qualify this, but let's just hear what she says. She says that in America there was no visible misery and want, right? There was poverty, but there was not misery. Unlike in France, where in France there were, the majority of people were miserable, were living in sustenance conditions. She says that in America, there was a conflict between the rich and the poor. There were rich, there were poor, but there was no misery. There were no pure charity cases, and the people were not driven by wants. Um, the success of the American Revolution, she says, was not fated, right? It didn't have to happen. And it wasn't due, she thinks, simply to the wisdom of the founders, although she thinks they're quite wise. And it didn't become a model for other revolutions. It didn't have a success in having coattails. But she says the reason for its success, and also the reason that was failed to be transferred to France and other Russia and other revolutions, was that in America, the predicament of poverty was absent from the American scene whereas it was present everywhere else. That's on pages 62 to 63 or page 58, depending on what edition you're using. Now, she immediately says, right, and this has to be acknowledged, that this is a sweeping statement, and it is, and that it's subject to two very important qualifications. Now, the first qualification is that there was poverty in America, right? But she thinks there was no misery, at least not visible misery. She says that the problem that the revolutionaries faced in America was not a social problem. It was not, the revolutionaries in America were not arguing to free the poor from need. They were arguing a political problem, namely to free all of the people, the rich and the poor, from a tyrannical king and government. And so the predicament um, of that the American Revolution aimed to solve, the problem that it aimed to solve was not poverty, but powerlessness, but invisibility, that their lives were without consequence because they were ruled by a tyrant or a monarch. And for her, the poor and the rich were both invisible in the sense, but especially, but even the poor were not invisible completely because they could still act and participate in at least local government. They were not invisible in the terms that Ralph Ellison speaks about in Invisible Man. They were not plunged out of history, where mankind takes no notice of them. And so John Adams, right, who's the founder that she most relies on in this section, says that, and she quotes this long passage by Adams where she says, "The poor man's conscience is clear, yet he is ashamed. He feels himself out of the sight of others, groping in the dark, to be wholly overlooked, and to know it," she says about Adams, "are intolerable." That um, in being miserable, fundamentally miserable, the real intolerable aspect of that is not that you're poor, it's that you're invisible. And that this American conviction that she attributes to Adams is that darkness rather than want is the curse of poverty, right? This is sort of the sort of extraordinary claim that she's making here, that what really makes poverty or misery um, uh, intolerable is not that that you have wants. It's that you are invisible and powerless and unseen. And she says that the poor in America didn't see themselves as invisible. And I mean, everyone saw themselves as invisible because of the king, but they didn't see themselves as having an intolerable condition. And as a result, the revolution in America was fought not out of a desire to give people comfort, but to provide freedom. And she says Adams' insight has been forgotten, right? The idea that the passion for distinction is a great spring for human action has been bought cheaply, she writes, by consumption. In a sense, once the poor become wealthier, they prefer consumption and a life with goods over visibility and distinction, and they cease to become politically active and exercise their freedom. That's just an aside. But the point is, the first qualification to her claim, right, that that the reason for the success was that there was no poverty in America that was visible, is that unlike in Europe where there was real misery, she thinks the poor in America uh, did not have that need for want that drove the European masses. The second qualification, of course, is slavery. Um, um, and she talks about how uh, the American founders, and not just the American founders, right? This is an important distinction she wants to make. The American founders and also European visitors to America, um, overlooked what she calls the abject and degrading misery of slavery. She says the slave in America, unlike the poor man, was wholly overlooked, right? People respected poor men, poor whites especially, but they completely ignored, didn't see even the slave. She says there was no pity in America. Um, and she says that slavery, which was the primordial crime, right, which she talks about on page 66 or 61, um, she says slavery is so fundamentally incompatible with freedom. Um, but the problem is that the Americans didn't see the slaves, that the slaves were so miserable in a sense, um, that they just weren't even seen. They weren't even considered. Um, and she says this indifference was not peculiar to Americans, because Europeans who came to visit said the same things. And she says that it must be blamed on slavery. Um, uh, and so that's the second qualification, right? Which is that, in a sense, she's saying that America could focus on freedom because it didn't see misery and it didn't see slavery. And obviously, she thinks there's a mistake in not seeing those. And yet, and this is sort of you know, and yet that was one of the reasons the revolution could succeed and focus on freedom. And so I mean, one has to ask, what does that mean to say that it succeeded by not seeing misery where misery was, especially amongst, as she says on page 66 or 61, she said that there lived 400,000 Negroes, blacks in America, along with 1,850,000 white men in America in the middle of the 18th century. And she says, even in the absence of reliable statistical data, right, we may be sure that the percentage of complete destitution and misery was lower in the countries of the old world, right? There was more misery in America than there was in Europe, but it wasn't seen because slavery was so completely invisible uh, in the political world of the revolution and the founders. The third section um, moves from this to the idea of compassion. And that's where the next five sections of this chapter are going to focus. And it's conceptually the core of the chapter on the social question. We'll start it today, but we'll finish it and talk much more about it on a week from today, next Friday. Um, the point that she wants to make here is that there are two different ideas of the people, right? In America, um, the people that carried out the revolution included the entire people who were visible, right? For the most part, white people, but also poor, rich, and others, but not the slaves. The revolutionaries, she said, belonged to the people, and they were politically powerless, and they felt oppressed. And so, as a result, the revolution was for the rich and the poor, the educated and the uneducated. Whereas in France, the revolutionaries did not see themselves as the people; they were of a different social class, right? And this class aspect of the revolutionaries is very important. At the best, the revolutionaries in France could see themselves as working for the best of the people from above, pitying the people or having compassion or pity for the people. But they were of a separate class and they didn't share the people's suffering. And thus, and this will come back in later sections of this chapter, because the revolutionaries had to, in a sense, act for the people, but were not of the people. And because they had to act for people who suffered, but themselves didn't suffer, they were much more open to the charge of hypocrisy than the American revolutionaries. And as a result, this idea of hypocrisy, of tearing off the mask of hypocrisy and showing that people were not real revolutionaries, was part of what could lead to the French Terror, which undid the revolution. For Robespierre, right, the head of the Montgarde faction, the faction of the more radical Parisian revolutionaries, he says in a speech, "The people, they applaud me. The miserable, the wretched, they applaud me." His goal was to give the people happiness, not freedom. After the fall of the more moderate faction in the French Revolution, the Girondists, um, Arendt says, and she's here quoting Saint Just, it was no longer freedom but happiness that became the new idea in Europe. For those who don't know the revolutionary history in France, the Girondists, who were located in a particular region, I think in the south of France, were more moderate, constitutionals, federalists against central power, whereas the Parisian Jacobins uh, uh, were much more focused on centralization, on a more radical idea of democracy and revolutionary justice. They're the ones who led eventually the Committee on Public Safety and carried out the Reign of Terror that led to the murder of so many revolutionaries. Uh, the point Arendt wants to make here is that compassion or pity, and we're going to have to talk about what the difference between compassion and pity is. We get to it in this section, but it becomes much more thematized in the next section, section 4. But basically, compassion and pity are used synonymously here up to a point. But what we should realize is that she's going to make a distinction, right? And the distinction is that compassion is a kind of mute love for somebody else in their suffering, but without any effort or ability to do anything about it, just a kind of love, um, uh, where you reach out to them. The model, and then pity is a kind of looking at them and having pity for them, where you set yourself above them and you think you can or have the responsibility to, in some sense, solve their problems. Um, the the greatest the greatest poetic uh, manifestation of this in her mind that she talks about here is the chapter from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov on the Grand Inquisitor. In that chapter, if you remember it, uh, 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 Jesus comes down. It takes place shortly after the murder of, I think, I forget how many, 100,000 people during the Inquisition in Spain. And Jesus comes down and stands there. And the Grand Inquisitor, who has, you know, uh, taken upon himself to kill these people, and sits there and starts to interrogate Jesus. Says, "Why are you here? What are you doing?" And Jesus just stands there, says nothing. And the Grand Inquisitor, is going crazy, like, "Why are you here? What are you doing?" And finally, the Grand Inquisitor says to Jesus, "This is all your fault, right? Uh, you told the people they could be free. They can't be free. They don't know how to be free. You left us to clean up your mess, and we have to, in a sense, give the people bread and circus, and then control them and kill them when needed, but keep order." Um, and and Arendt says that Jesus here is in his silence is the embodiment of compassion, whereas the Grand Inquisitor looks down at the people as pitiful, and then decides how he is going to, in a sense, govern them or rule them. Um, and it's in that distinction between pity and compassion that Arendt is going to uh, build her thinking about the social question in in the end of the chapter, which we'll read for next week. But we do get it in this chapter, so it's worth us at least being aware of. Um, but in this chapter, what she's interested in is um, how compassion, which really is what she means by pity, right? So I'm going to start speaking of pity and passion together. How compassion and pity with the people by a group of revolutionaries who think of themselves above the people um, leads to a need for what Rousseau calls a general will or a volonté générale, right? The point here is that um, uh, we need uh, the people to be one. The problem, of course, is that the people is not one, right? There's rich, there's poor, there's bakers, there's lawyers, there's all sorts of plurality and diversity, and there's people in Paris, and there's people in Provence, and there's people in other areas, and so how do you make all these people one? Well, one answer is you need an enemy, right? You need a third that you unite against. And what Rousseau uh, comes to see is that the easiest way to find an enemy is that you find the enemy within yourself. That each one of us has a particular will, which wants what we want, but we also know that we all have to want a general will, a universal will that we would want if we were thinking from the rational position of the universal Frenchman or the universal person. And the general will, therefore, is not a will of any unique individual. It's the will that we all would have to the extent we were rational. Um, and and so what Rousseau imagines, right, is that compassion and pity um, mean that we rule the poor from the position of a neutral rationality, a general will. And that general will is then thought to be the will of all, the will of one will for the whole people. So against a kind of plurality, against a federalism, as the American Revolution will end up imagining it, where you have different states and different peoples and different ideas, and against the Girondists in France who thought that there should be, there should be different governments in different parts of France. The Jacobins embrace a kind of Rousseauian general will out of compassion, saying that we can find one rational general will out of our compassion slash pity that should govern the whole country, the whole people with one will, with one force that can unite all the different classes into one will. And that's based in this idea of a compassion, a wishing of the well for the lower people, for the people below us. This, of course, puts the rulers, the revolutionaries, in the position of having to um, claim that they are acting for and in the interests of the lower classes when they are not lower class. And this opens them to the charge of hypocrisy, right? But it also opens, it initiates, in a sense, a battle. Because if I say I think in order to help the lower class, we should do this, and you say in order to help the lower class, we should do this, well, we're both making a claim of absolute central rule and what compassion demands. And the only way to address it is to kill the other people through a guillotine, right? Through the reign of terror, which is what happened in France. And so Arendt says that once compassion for the low, but really compassion understood as pity, because if compassion would just be mute, right, it wouldn't try and solve the problem. But once compassion becomes political, it leads to tyranny. And so she ends the chapter with this extraordinary quote on page 82 or 77, where she says, as a rule, it is not compassion which sets out to change the worldly conditions, in order to ease human suffering, right? Compassion usually doesn't try and change the world, right? It just is compassionate. It just wants to give you a hug. But if compassion does try and change the world and ease human suffering, it will shun the drawn out, wearisome processes of persuasion, negotiation, and compromise, which are the processes of law and politics, and lend its voice to the suffering itself, which must claim for swift and direct action. That is, for action with the means of violence. And so her point is that compassion is a beautiful virtue. It's like love, but it doesn't belong in politics. But when it enters politics and we claim compassion or pity leads us to ease human suffering, um, it will radicalize incredibly quickly. And that's what she thinks happened in the French Revolution, which turned the French Revolution against freedom. Um, she offers the example of Melville's Billy Budd as an example of what happens when absolute goodness enters the world, and shows how it both absolute goodness and absolute wickedness are incompatible with a politics in which freedom and law are respected. All right, I'm going to stop there. There's obviously a lot to talk about. Um, these are provocative and controversial themes. So just remind you, we can have an honest argument. People just be attack people's arguments. Don't attack the person in the chat. And happy to have a conversation about it. If you're interested in joining the public conversation, you can go down to the React button, click on that, and hit raise hand and ask questions here. Uh, great, Robert. Robert. Robert, you're muted, so you got to unmute yourself.
Okay. Am I right that she distinguishes between pity and compassion by saying that it can only be for an individual? Or is the distinction something other than that?
Um, so she does distinguish between pity and compassion. It's mostly just so you know, I gave you a bit of a precursor. She's going to do it much more in the next section, section 4. But so she does distinguish pity and compassion. One way in which she distinguishes them is that compassion
Um,
is more horizontal, equal, right? Whereas pity is usually looked down at from above. Um, and the example she gives in this chapter with the Grand Inquisitor and Jesus is that Jesus simply has compassion for the suffering, and um, he he doesn't speak, he doesn't say anything, he just cries, he has a tear. Whereas the Grand Inquisitor, motivated by pity, wants to, uh, in a sense, solve the problem of suffering. Um, yeah, I think you could say that. I mean, can you have compassion for a community or a group of people as opposed to an individual? Um, uh, I think you could. It's easier, I think, to
let
have
me
compassion for
let
an
me just
individual.
throw out something. Yeah, let me just throw out something, and I'll wait for next time to talk about it. It seems to me that her distinction between pity and compassion is not nearly fine grained enough. That
Well,
there
first
are
of all,
other.
yeah, let me agree with you. I mean, she, I mean, Arendt is not a systematic thinker, and especially in a book like this, which is meant for a general audience. She's speaking at times, she's using words that other people use, And so she begins speaking about compassion. And only later does she tell you that she wants you to make a distinction between compassion and pity. And so you have to sort of, and the same thing, by the way, with poverty and misery. She makes this distinction between poverty and misery, but she sometimes uses poverty to mean misery, and sometimes she means poverty to mean poverty. And you have to, you could say that's bad writing. Um, and maybe it is. I don't want to. I'm not sitting here to defend her, right? But what she's trying to speak colloquially and also make these distinctions, and as a result, she I think breeds confusion at times. You have to you have to sort of penetrate um uh the colloquial aspect of her work and ask in each case, well, when she says compassion, is she meaning compassion or pity? Because she's not consistent. And this happens in a lot of her work. It's not just in this book. Um, there are words that she makes, clear distinctions about and then uses them interchangeably in certain other places. And it's frustrating as a reader. I admit that. Um, but I don't know. If you're asking more conceptually, is the distinction itself not fine-grained enough? Maybe. I mean, I think it's there. I think the key is that pity is a relationship from above. If I pity you, I think I'm better than you. If I have compassion for you, I
Okay.
don't I don't have to be better than you. I think that's the foundation of the distinction.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. A lot of questions have shown up, so let's see what we can do. I'll try and get through them. Susan.
Yeah, I just have to go on record, I think, about her claims that the revolutionaries opened the door for this idea of, addressing people's needs. And I just don't see how that squares with the facts that the people, the women of Paris, the people who participated and fought the revolution made this happen. I don't think anybody opened the door. They broke down the door. So I really just don't know where she's getting this. I granted these people were in the legislative assemblies and so forth, but I just think that the people who actually fought the revolution made all that happen for better or worse. And the other thing, I know she always uses the term men, men, men for everything that anybody ever did. But in this case, there were significant, important women in the French Revolution, and it is upsetting that she continues to obliterate them, as the Jacobins did at the time. They did everything they could to silence the women and to shut down the women's revolutionary organizations. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, I'd say that fits with her point, right? The point is that the revolutionaries who took control and ran the revolution, right, um, wanted to see themselves as speaking for everybody. That was her claim. Um, and she thinks that was the great mistake they made, that they thought they could speak for the people, whether it's the poor or the women or others. Um, and she thinks that in doing so, the way the idea that allowed them to speak for others was compassion or pity. Um, because then they could say, see, we're speaking for the less well off. Um, and in so doing, they turned from freedom to uh, necessity, and that's the argument she's making. But um, there's no doubt that there were other strains of the revolution, feminist strains, constitutionalist strains, and others that were ignored, and that's a large part of her point. Um, and in the American Revolution, her point is that they were not as concerned with speaking for the people. They were trying to provide a constitutional structure to allow the different states and the different parts of the country to be free. But to do so, she thinks they had to ignore misery and ignore slavery. And I think I think what's so both brilliant and frustrating about that to me, right, is that on the one hand, there's a certain sense in which she's saying the only revolution in history that at least for a time succeeded in establishing freedom and founding freedom could only do so insofar as it was blind to the most abject misery in the world on a racial basis. Now, if you treat that as simply a statement of analysis, I would just say it's profoundly unsettling, right? And yet there's, I think, as I understand it, as I see it, a profoundly unsettling truth to it. What does that mean? And how do we address that? Is, I think, the problem she confronts us with. Anyway, that's how I see it. Julie.
I have a twofold question. I'll do the first of all, and then the second. I'm referring to a passage on page 69, which I believe is when you're quoting the numbers, it's in the text that has the lower numbers. So
Okay.
I believe it should be your page 69, and it comes just before the paragraph, whatever theoretically.
Yeah, whatever theoretically.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so what I'm questioning is this, and what I would like to have unpacked is the value of a policy may be gauged by the extent to which it will contradict all particular interests, and that the value of a man may be judged by the extent to which he acts against his own interest and against his own will. And I understand the division between the particular within one as being what could be the rogue against the unification of factions that have to be brought together in order to fight against the enemy being the particular interest. But what I question is what happens if the particular interest is the right interest or the good interest rather than the general interest, which might be a misguided interest and needs to hear the voice of that particular interest.
Well,
so that's my question.
It's a good question. I think it's one that Aaron shares. I mean, that's why she's critical of this elevation of the general interest. The argument here is that these so-called compassionate revolutionaries, right, are present themselves as selfless. They say, I'm rich, right? But I'm gonna argue for the poor. And in arguing for the poor, they proclaim themselves, right, selflessness, and that becomes the virtue of the revolutionary. She says it's the sort of core virtue of all revolutionaries. And that you can judge a value of a man by his selflessness, which is, of course, what leads to the charge of hypocrisy, right? Which I've mentioned a couple of times, but we'll get to that in the next chapter, because what this means is that all revolutionaries are open to the charge of hypocrisy because they're open to the charge that they're actually not acting in the interest of the poor, but in their own interest of keeping power and or other interests. Your question about, well, couldn't the non-general, the particular interests, be better interests? And Arendt says, yeah, sure. That's why what she thinks freedom requires, right, is a constitutional government that allows different people with different interests in different parts of the country and different places to pursue different goals through something like a principle of federalism or decentralization. Um, and so you're absolutely right. She's suspicious of the sort of one common interest. She still, I mean, the caveat here is that she still um, wants to hold on to the fact that we should put the public interest above our own, the res publica. But for her, the public interest means the interest in freedom and thus the interest in decentralization and constitutional limits. And that's going to be, when we get to chapter 5 and 6, that's going to be the core of our reading.
Okay, that helps. And then, so as I understand what you just said, she's saying that this way is one that identifies, would identify happiness over freedom, or would it be identifying freedom over happiness?
I'm not sure which this way is, but the French
I mean, the
approach-
way of listening to the particular rather than going with the rule of the general.
Okay, so in listening to the particular, you're allowing different versions of interests to emerge in public, which for her is more in line with a constitutionally free republic, as opposed to a state that insists that there only be one interest and we will tell you what it is.
Okay, and then the other thing is that at the end of Life of the Mind, when she says that there is that we can have a will to freedom, but that will to freedom doesn't really or not that it doesn't really, it has a different concept than will to freedom that turns into action. And I'm just wondering whether or not will to freedom, when it's only in the mind, might be able to be called compassion, but will to freedom, when it moves into action or political action, would be called pitying.
It's a thought I hadn't thought about. I don't think so, Julie, but I don't know. I mean, I think the distinction is that in willing, right? Um, uh, we are concerned with the question of freedom and the problem of freedom. What happens if my will goes against God's will or against some other rational will? And so the problem of the free will is one of how to how to control the free will. Um, uh, I don't know if that has to do with compassion or pity. I think it has to do with um, rationalism and willing and freedom. So I don't see that, but I hadn't thought about it before. So I'm happy
Okay, thank you.
Vigdis.
I want to point to it's in my book on page 76. I have a Penguin book. It is in the middle of a paragraph that starts with this shift of emphasis. It is in relation to talking about Rousseau. So, and she says that it was of greater relevance that the very word consent, with its overtones of deliberate choice and considered opinion, was replaced by the word will, which essentially excludes all processes of exchange of opinion and an eventual agreement between them. The will, if it is to function at all, must indeed be one and indivisible. A divided will would be inconceivable. There is no possible mediation between wills as there is between opinions. And I think this is right to the core of Arendt's thinking of the political and the importance of different opinions. So I wonder if you could say something more about this, how she judges this, and especially if you could say a few words of how do you assess this divide in our society? Because I think if we are going to, not the easiest.
Okay, let me see what I can do, Vigdis. So, you started with the idea that consent, with its overtones of deliberate choice and considered opinion, was replaced by the word will, which essentially excludes all process of exchanges of opinions. So I have a little chart at the bottom of my book, right? Will of all, right? Consent, institutional rule. What I mean by that is that for Rousseau, everyone has a will, a particular will. And if you were to add all them up and put them all together, you'd have all the wills, the will of all. And you'd have to figure out where consent is, and you'd have to negotiate it. And therefore, you would need institutions that allow you to negotiate the different particular wills and which one is going to govern and how they're going to work together. The next line of my chart says general will, and unanimity of public opinion. And the idea here is that instead of the will of all, in which we take all our wills and we consider them in a plurality, the general will tries to find one will and says, look, you have all these different general wills, but they're all wrong because they're all particular. In fact, I mean, Rousseau's point is that every particular will is wrong insofar as it is a particular will. And so what we need is to figure out not how to find some compromise amongst all the particular wills through an institutional rule, through a constitutional system, but we need to then ask a different question. Well, if we were to abstract from all particularity, poor, rich, white, black, French, German, whatever, what would be the true will? What would be the general will, the will that's rational? And that's what Rousseau's general will is, the volonté générale. And the idea is that it then is the one rational will, and everybody has to have that will. And as Rousseau famously says, if anyone doesn't have that will and they refuse to have that will, we have to force them to be free. And so, that's the distinction she's making here. I think if you want to compare it, and I'm not going to go on to a long diatribe about modern politics, but I mean, I think the clear, the easiest way to talk about modern politics in this regard is to simply talk about how the United States was imagined as a constitutional republic, a federal constitutional republic, in which, while the Constitution provided some rubric, different states and different peoples could live quite differently. And for a whole host of reasons, largely out of the progressive era, right, starting in the 1920s, but also out of, the Civil War and then the Civil Rights Movement. And then also out of the rise of the United States as an imperial power, which required the country to speak as one in foreign policy. You saw a massive centralization of power in the United States that was completely unimagined by the Constitution and the founders. Now, they did think that there was a danger of centralization. They thought it would come from Congress. It turns out it's come from the presidency and through the administrative state. And it's happened in both parties, right? And so this is a big part of the reason that Arendt is going to argue in the last chapter of this book on the revolutionary tradition and the lost spirit, that in chapter 6, that the American Revolution has failed in the end because the institutional, constitutional breaks on a kind of unified, unanimous public opinion have largely been overcome And we've largely become more like France in that regard. And so she thinks that's the lost spirit of the revolution. So that's one way to think about it within a contemporary context. I mean, I could say much more about that, but let's stick to our end. At least if it comes up again, I'll say more, but we'll see. Joanne.
Hi. I on pages 61 and 62, where she's talking about slavery and how it was really overlooked and gives a sense that it really wasn't that important during the years of the American Revolution. I happen to be taking a course on slavery and fighting slavery in colonial America. So some of this is pretty fresh in my mind. In fact, I had a class just this morning. But if you say the American Revolution, or what are we talking about 1776, or are we talking about the writing of the Constitution in 1787? What is the American Revolution? Is it just the battles? Is it the war itself?
No, you're asking a good question. We talked a bit, I think, last time, right? The revolution, it's the founding of freedom, and it's more than just the War of Liberation. It includes, so it goes from, the revolutionary battles, probably until the early 19th century, or at some point when she thinks that the Constitution becomes worshipped and established. Takes a while. So yeah,
Mhm.
it's not dateable to one thing, but if you were to, if you had to put one date on it, it would be the Constitution. Yeah, but it's bigger than that even. Yes.
That's what I'm thinking too. And in fact, slavery was not overlooked at all during the writing of the Constitution. A guy named Charles Pinckney, again, this is fresh in my mind from this morning. Pinckney, from South Carolina, a slaveholder, was very active in the discussions about how to as you probably know, how to count slaves, how to count enslaved people versus normal, regular citizens, in other words, white people. And not only the Three-Fifth Compromise was he responsible for, but a number of the other clauses and articles in the Constitution, he was really the perpetrator of, and they all passed. And they were about fugitive slaves. They were about looking into the future and when the slave trade should be ended or could be ended. So this was like a massive program. And then if you begin to talk about the Louisiana Purchase and what all happened then and how much more slavery came into American society, I just can't buy her claim that the American Revolution was about freedom, not necessity. It was about necessity for the merchants of Boston during the Boston Tea Party era. It was also about it during the writing of the Constitution when the slaveholders, the necessity of the businesses of the slaveholders took really prime place. And even though there was plenty of disagreement from Northerners during the writing of the Constitution, those delegates, but basically the Southerners won. And I really think we're still living with that legacy. So that's my point.
Thank you, Joanne. It's a good point. And it's one that I think I think there's a lot that I agree with in it. That said, let's just at least make her argument from the other side, right? Which is that, what does it mean? I don't know exactly what she means when she says that it was invisible, except that, I think it clearly means, mean, she says at the bottom of, well, in the middle of 61, the paragraph that begins, history tells us that it is no means a matter of course, right? She says that as it is, we are tempted to ask ourselves if the goodness of the poor white man's country did not depend to a considerable degree upon black labor and black misery, right? Which of course it did. And then she gives those statistics I gave earlier. From this, we can only conclude that the institution of slavery carries an obscurity even blacker than the obscurity of poverty. The slave, not the torn man, was wholly overlooked. For if Jefferson and others could, to a lesser degree, were aware of the primordial crime upon which the fabric of American society rested, if they trembled when they thought that God is just, they did so because they were convinced of the incompatibility of the institution of slavery with the foundation of freedom, not because they were moved by pity or by a feeling of solidarity with their fellow men. That's the key line.
Mhm.
What she's saying is, look, yes, Pinckney demanded these things of, these there's four clauses that are usually thought of, that are called today the slave clauses. Importantly, none of them mention slavery, and none of them mention color. And what she's saying is people like Jefferson and Adams, right? They weren't moved by pity. They didn't keep slavery out of the Constitution out of pity. They didn't demand that slavery be done away with out of pity. Didn't happen. What they were concerned with was creating a document that could found freedom. And they made compromises in order to do so. Compromises that, when Frederick Douglass reads the Constitution, he says there's nothing in the Constitution, right, that's pro-slavery. Because he says, and she would agree, that the founders kept it out. And she says they could do so because they just weren't moved by pity. Whether they had pity or not, they weren't moved by it. They were focused on one thing, right? Creating what they thought would be a constitutional country, republic, that would allow freedom to exist. They weren't focused on eradicating misery. And that's an extraordinary claim. And what one makes of it is and what I said before is I think the argument is that, and again, it's one that I think is profoundly paradoxical and difficult, which is that the one constitution, the one government that was created that she thinks was offered a foundation for freedom, one that has led to a foundation for freedom for many more people than were available to it when it was first imagined, was one that more than any other excluded compassion and pity as motivating forces, and thus was blind, not literally blind, but blind in their thinking to the massive misery, especially racial and slave misery, that was around them in the country. Whether you think that's an act of Republican brilliance or of incredible human degeneracy, or some mix of the two, I think that's the argument she's making. Stephen.
Hi, good afternoon. I guess I want to add to some of the things you're saying about this invisibility thing, but as I've been reading the book this time, I'm struck by its very, very Christian nature. And I'm remembering at the same time that this is being written in 1963, which is really her first book after the Eichmann controversy. So she's already been excommunicated, basically, by the Jewish community anyway. Um, and she is, those who are still with her, so to speak, she's writing this book for, which is,
Steve, just so we're on the same page, right?
yeah,
She's writing, this book is published in 63, which is the same year that Eichmann in Jerusalem is published.
right.
The controversy is not happening before this book is published.
Okay, I could be wrong, but I'm under the impression that it's already begun. But I'll stand by what you say. Um, I'll go back to where I was going with that is that I thought it's very brave of her, even in her state of somewhat loneliness, you know, being excommunicated by her co-religionists, that she still finds time to rebuke her own disciples. And and that's what I mean by this concept of invisible. I find it very, very bold um, for her to say something like that poverty is universal and it's not seen in America. I don't think she means that in the literal sense at all. It was quite visible in America, and her hero, Alexander Hamilton, who comes up all over this book, um, was a witness to it and was very sensitive to it and got into horrendous debates in the state of New York with who was the governor at the time, at the time of the revolution. I'm sorry if I can't remember his name right now, but uh, it's not a question of it being invisible. The southern part of the United States are the wealthiest per capita people on the planet at the time of the revolution. And their means of attaining that wealth is a subject of, you know, great debate everywhere in the world, not just in the United States. Um, anyway, where I'm going with this is she says that poverty is universal and it's not seen in America in very much the same way that Jesus says that the poor you will have with you always, but you will not always have me. I believe he says that in Matthew. Um, and the phrase itself first appears in Deuteronomy, but that's another thing. Um, I don't think that the um, Jesus says that in rebuke of his own disciples because he accepted some very expensive perfume and was anointed by it by a servant. And they say, oh, you know, she could have done better with the money. And he says, go fuck yourself. Um, you know, you're not gonna have me much longer. It's 2 days before his crucifixion, in fact. And you know, get with it. The poor are with you. Oh, this is part of the human condition. So I think that is the sense in which she means invisible. And I just, you know, I'm just very struck by this in this book. And Jesus himself makes an appearance in this book in the form of Billy Budd.
Yeah.
It's no accident
Well,
that,
and against the Grand Inquisitor. I mean, there's
yeah, and that too. Yeah. Um, it's you already mentioned that, so I did. I I just think that we are talking after all about someone whose first thesis was about the concept of love in Augustine. Um, so you know, and I think in this book it's important to bear in mind how profoundly influenced she is by the fact that the American Revolution is the first one to put into practice the very, very Christian idea that there is equality before the law. That has never been tried before. I mean, and the fact that the American Revolution is in fact a Christian revolution is very much on her mind. I don't know why she doesn't come out and just say that. Say that.
Steve,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think it's fascinating. I mean, let me just say, I would almost read it the opposite. I mean, the argument here, right, is that the Christian revolution, the one
Yeah.
that, well, it depends what we mean by Christian, right? I mean,
That's true too.
this is the issue, right? The Grand Inquisitor revolution is the French Revolution. It's
Right.
the revolution that you know, stands for what she thinks and Dostoevsky thinks the church has come to stand for, right? Which is the that we have been put in charge by Jesus and God, and our job is to keep order. And if that means giving people bread and circus, we will do so. And the whole premise of this chapter is that the Christian, even the good Christian Jesus idea of love and compassion, which is represented by Jesus in Dostoevsky and Billy Budd in Melville's Billy Budd, is fundamentally apolitical, right? You can't, she thinks it's an apolitical idea. The American version of politics, right, which refuses um, a kind of absolute compassion and is based on, as we were just talking about with Joanne, which is based on a fundamental rejection of compassion and pity, uh, and instead a rational embrace of governmental constitutional limits. I think for her, I mean, again, she's not putting it in these terms, but I don't think that's Christian. In fact, one could argue it goes back to her kind of Jewish roots, right? A kind of the idea of, of the Talmudic study where there's lots and lots of opinions, but no one truth. I mean, there's been a number of people who've read this as a kind of manifestation of her Judaism, even though I don't think it is in any kind of conscious way in her work. But I think that, I don't think that her politics here is Christian.
I beg to differ with you, but I think also, like I draw a very sharp distinction between Jesus and his relationship with his disciples, and when I say Christian, that's what I'm referring to, and
Yeah.
the church, which is
Right.
something else
But even
entirely.
so, politics for her is not about love and compassion. I mean, in the human condition, she says, love needs to be kept fully out of politics. And she says it right here again in this chapter.
Right, and it's not a dispassionate or lacking in compassion when Jesus says the poor will be with you always.
Yeah.
He's not lacking compassion. He's being a realist.
Right. But she's saying that politics should lack compassion. I mean, this is the argument she's making in this book, that politics should be rational rather than compassionate and passionate. But let me go on because I got like
Go ahead, please.
a
It's okay.
number of questions, but thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Lee.
Yeah, thank you. Since we've discussed compassion and pity, Arendt also wants to distinguish them from goodness, and which is why she brings up the example of Billy Budd. But the question I have is her use of Billy Budd appropriate in this context, given the way she's defined goodness in the human condition, where she, and I'll quote, goodness has a tendency to hide from being seen and heard, and it's this lack of outward phenomenal manifestation. And in the moment a good work becomes known in public, it loses its character of goodness.
Yeah.
When Billy Budd hits Claggart, it's clearly visible, and so yeah, that's my question.
Well, the point is that when goodness so goodness needs to hide, right? Because if you
right
publicize your goodness, you suddenly, you people think, oh, well, maybe you're just doing it to get attention or to be seen as good. And true goodness needs to hide. Billy
Right.
Budd is truly good, but and so when his goodness enters the world, it does so in the only way it can, which is violently, through, struck dead by the angel of God, yet the angel must hang. And and it just shows for her the way in which goodness and compassion and pity tarnish politics, and not only tarnish but threaten to destroy politics because they bring an absolute into politics which is not absolute. This is where the conversation I was just having with Steve is so important, right? Passion doesn't have limits, right? That's the problem with compassion or passion, is that it's limitless. And Arendt thinks that politics has to be limited.
Right.
And this is the problem.
Yeah. I'll just quickly add one more thing. Billy Budd could have struck Claggett in private, had that opportunity, and it would have been hidden. So
Yeah, but he was charged in public and hit him. Yeah, we'll get. I mean,
yeah, okay.
I've written a lot on Billy Budd. We can always talk about Billy Budd. I love it. It's one of my favorite books. I teach it every year. So thank you.
Oh, good.
All right. George, you're up. Let's try and get one or two of these. I got a lot of questions. I'm not going to get to all of them, but let me see what I can do. So try and keep them. George, you got to unmute and try and keep it short. George?
I'm unmuting now. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, now you are.
Okay, I'll be quick. My question has to do with an article I just read. I just want to show you the article. It says human behavior in the context of low probability, high impact events. I think that's when we talk about genocide or Holocaust, things like that, and what's going on politically. That's a high impact event. It's also a low probability event as far as Americans are concerned. And this is where it comes to the, the misery thing. Misery, they would say in this article, it's in Nature, but it's open access, so you can access the article. It's worth reading. Misery is social and non-political if you don't happen to be too miserable. Whereas if your greatest misery is loneliness, then you can say, okay, that's not political. On the other hand, if your greatest misery is getting killed, that becomes a political thing. I would like you to just comment on that.
Oh, look, I mean, as she said, these revolutionaries were no fools, and there's no doubt that misery and poverty both drive us, and for good reason. I mean, what we haven't really focused on it, but the sort of radical claim that she's embracing here, the claim by John Adams, right, is that what makes the poor really unhappy or potentially miserable is not hunger. It's lack of visibility. Now, is she right or wrong? Right? I mean, Adams is making a claim that what drives poor people and what they really want is not a better meal, but to be seen and heard. And this idea is at the heart of Arendt's work. I mean, it's the heart of her idea of human rights, which she expresses in chapter 9 of The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says that the only human right is the right to be seen and heard in public in a way that matters, not to live. And this is part of her thinking throughout her life, and she here attributes it to John Adams. And she says people have forgotten this, but one could say she's simply wrong, right? Her argument is poor people understand her. The people who don't understand her are poor people who become rich, who then want to consume more and don't worry about being invisible. But it's I think one of the more radical claims in the book and in her work, and should be taken seriously. Let me just get another one or two questions in. David.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of see if we can move into a positive direction for where this goes. I want to say that she's absolutely right that the general will, when the moment you go into that, and it was really hard to get her about historical necessity, right? The laws of history, the Bolsheviks and the Nazis both believed that they were on the wave of history that was going their way, and therefore it was selfless of Eichmann to support the history and by doing what was necessary, which was kill as close to 6 million of those Jews as he could get it done very efficiently and on the case. Okay. And but I want to talk about, as I understand it, in the Chinese communists were later than the Bolsheviks, and they have a single will through the Chinese Communist Party, which does produce all kinds of conflict within the Politburo and out there in the world. And by unifying the will of 1.4 billion people, they've been able to accomplish raising from poverty 800 million people, material conditions, at the price, guess what, of freedom. Our level of regimentation that we would freak out at that, we had these limits of what we could choose to do, whatever. Okay. So that is, but finally, all the nation states in 2015 committed themselves to instituting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is a whole program of working with the environment, but also to ensure the welfare of every single human being. And the governments approved that, not of just their citizens, but their residents. And so that's global public policy agreed by the United States and China. But do we have that? Have you heard about that? No. So I'm just saying there is a way to get the general will to come out of crime, out of war, and want globally to institute what we just said, a Bill of Social Rights, in essence.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think I'll take that as a comment, which I think is a good comment. And, all I would say is I think that to the extent that your social rights are social, the only way to achieve it is, and at least in Arendtian terms, is a sacrifice of a certain amount of freedom. We're over time. We're going to be talking about the social question again next week. So I'm hoping that those of you who have questions can maybe write down your questions or keep them for next week, and we'll continue next week. All right. I apologize for that, but if you're one of the people who have your hand up, Kathy, John, Max, or Jeff, I'll try and call on you early on next week if you raise your hand. Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and thank you for a difficult, but I hope exciting and provocative conversation. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you on Monday, maybe.
Gracias.
Roger really should, or you, Jana, could help him to time everybody. So there's a maximum of 5 minutes, let's say, for any conversation. That's all. You can't get to everybody unless you do that.
I like very German.
Are going to close at 2:30, 2:35. Right? It's simple
Thank you,
as that.
David. It's a good idea. Yeah, let's talk
Roger
about
just cannot allow follow-ups. Can't. There's just no, unless you want to have 5, 6, 8 people in the queue who do not get any communication or don't get any airtime.
I
Right?
appreciate
So
that.
that's my input. I learned from last week that if you don't get your hand up, you won't get called on. But I don't think that's the right answer. And it's coming from the early speakers getting too long to talk, I suggest humbly.
Too much freedom.
Too much. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
We're going to try, Jan and I will talk about this. and try
Yeah,
and
we'll
figure out
talk
a
about it.
solution. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.